Well, good afternoon. Welcome again to St Chad's Rectory for some further reflections on a rule of life. Now, some of you might be asking, well, what qualifications do I have to speak about this? Well, the answer is not very much, actually. I'm a retailer of other people's ideas. But I also am a pilgrim and a traveller. And I found the need to have a structure, a rule of life. I was struck today by a friend of mine posting on Facebook some reflections from Terry Waite, who you may remember was held in captivity for an awful long time. And Terry Waite talks about the need he had to create a structure, to create a rhythm of life, even in captivity. He didn't necessarily use the word rule of life or the phrase rule of life, but he's talking about the same thing. And if you scan the literature about a rule of life, you will find a lot of different ways in. One thing that's interesting is how many people in perhaps a more contemporary spiritual tradition have felt the need to explore this in recent years. A spiritual writer called Richard Foster said this: "Perhaps somewhere in the subterranean chambers of your life, you have heard the call to deeper, fuller living. You have become weary of frothy experiences and shallow teaching. Every now and then you've caught glimpses, hints of something more than you have known. Inwardly, you long to launch out into the deep." And I think that developing a rule of life that's personal, that's meaningful, is a way of launching out into the deep. We're in a day of deep questions. Superficial answers will not do. Some of the cliches we've lived by have proved to be redundant. So let's launch out into the deep. And I'm going to share some thoughts from a man called Pete Greig, who some of you will know as one of the inspirers and founders of the 24/7 prayer movement. And Pete Greig talks about his own journey towards a rule of life, how at one time he would have shied away from that kind of language. But now he finds it essential. And he wrote an ABC of a rule of life. A, authentic. A rule enables us to develop a faith that is authentic and consistent with our convictions. Mountaintop experiences will never transform our characters without daily discipline, covenant community, and a set of personal values. Developing a faith that's authentic, that's real. It doesn't just happen. God's grace is always with us. But we need to cultivate an openness and expectancy. As I said yesterday, we need to have a rule, a discipline, so that we notice when the sun rises. And so for Pete Greig, a rule of life can be like a compass in confusing times. One that can orient us, one that can point us and reassure us we're on the right track. Rather like that signpost I talked about yesterday. Authentic. But of course, a rule of life, as I've already said, has to be balanced. We're in a world of extremes. If you were to scan the religious writings that are out there, that are communicated on social media, there are some deeply extreme and unhealthy models at work. A rule enables us to develop a balanced, sustainable and enjoyable rhythm of life. By putting things together in a few simple daily principles and practices, we find that we can manage the pressures on our time. We find we're not as driven by our own inner insecurity or the outer expectations of others, particularly perhaps for those of us in some form of public role, where the expectations of others can often be used as a stick to beat yourself with. The rule of life can help us live in that balanced way, because it gives a kind of checklist. We can use it to have a look at ourselves. And the rule of life can really include all sorts of things that nurture us. For me personally, I find that if I do not read poetry on a regular basis, or I do not read crafted words, then my life is impoverished. My capacity to articulate diminished. A rule of life which includes an element of poetry for me is essential. It helps create balance. And in that sense, the rule of life might be like a metronome that sets the rhythm, that doesn't push us forward too quickly, or doesn't allow us to sink into a sloth. Balanced, authentic, balanced, and centred. A rule enables us to centre our lives on Christ. Many Christians talk about being centred on Christ, but it's rather more elusive than we know. Being centred on Christ doesn't mean we are thinking religious thoughts all the time. Doesn't mean we are so heavenly minded that we're no earthly use. Being centred in Christ is about knowing where the source of our life actually lies. It's about being grounded in the simple presence of the promises of Christ. One of my spiritual networks that I'm part of is the Franciscan community. And St. Francis wrote this: "Every day I find so much sweetness and consolation in meditating upon the memory of the humble witness of the Son of God, that should I live till the end of the world, there would be little need of my hearing or meditating upon anything further in the Scriptures." For the Christian, Christ is the anchor. Christ is the grounding. And so a rule could be seen as a kind of plumb line that helps us measure what we think, say and do against the example of Jesus. That's our call for those of us who are Christians. And a rule of life can keep us centred. So the ABC that I commend to you, as you think about a rule of life for yourself, make sure it's authentic and real. Make sure it's not somebody else's, but yours. Make sure it's balanced, though, that it holds together some of the extremes in our own lives. And make sure it's centred on the Christ who calls us to live in peace, in shalom, and to live as a healing presence in the world. Because the rule of life isn't just for your benefit. It's to enable you to be the person you're created to be a channel of God's blessing, and to live the love of God, which we so much need to know of today. So may God bless you. Tomorrow I will perhaps be a little bit more practical and imagine us starting with a blank piece of paper and asking this question: how can we make the first steps in creating a rule of life? As I say, I'm no expert. I'm a very disorganised person. I need a rule to just keep me on the straight path and to be grounded in Christ, who is my centre. May God bless you today and always. Amen.